Hi everyone, Bosthany Rush Tano here, the internet's busiest Destiny nerd, and it's time for a review of this new Destiny 2 activity, Pantheon. Developer, publisher, historied game makers Bungie have released their 14th raid activity in Destiny 2 called Pantheon, but this one is a bit different to the previous three, being more of a best of or a remaster than a completely new set of experiences. Bungie took what I believe to be some of the better boss encounters, or at least the more unique encounters in the game, and have put them into a boss gauntlet. However, Destiny raids have a lot of encounters that have no boss at all, so Bungie didn't really have many choices in the matter of who to include, as the bosses in Pantheon are mostly better than their contemporaries, or at the very least, are more popular or well-liked. I do think there were a couple of better encounters, at least as far as any kind of tier list goes. The Gauntlet from Valve the Disciple would have been a good pick to have as a best of, to have one non-boss encounter in there if you wanted to mix things up. Maybe Shuro Chi from Last Wish to give some more life back to that experience, but as we'll discuss, all of these encounters have had slight adjustments to them that made them even harder. Perhaps these encounters weren't the best fit for Bungie's goals, or maybe they just didn't make the cut. There are also a couple of encounters that are in vaulted raids that I would have loved to have seen here instead of a couple of other bosses that we ended up seeing, Valka from Spire of Stars and Galron from Crown of Sorrows, but I guess Bungie isn't quite ready to bust open the vault. So how does it work? Week 1 had 4 bosses, with each reset adding another, scaling in difficulty every week by 5 levels. So enemies would get stronger, culminating in a -20 power level 8 boss gauntlet. -20 power is what we experience in contest mode, aka the day 1, now day 1 and day 2 raid experience whenever a new raid launches. Unlike the true contest mode raid though, this activity has surge modifiers, increasing your damage with select elements, so it's not a true one-to-one representation. However, going for the platinum scores is still probably one of the, if not the closest thing to a contest mode type experience that the game currently has to offer, and any serious day 1 raiding team should ensure that they can clear this place and get the final emblem reward if they seek a high placement in the raid race in June. And now a quick word from our sponsor. Good news everyone, we didn't scare off Rocket Money. They're sponsoring today's video. Money. It's pretty expensive. Yet here you are with your 14 subscription services, only 4 of which you're actually using right now. Why not put that money back in your pocket so that mass media can complain about millennials killing off yet another industry? Rocket Money is here to help with that. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that's here to help you manage your money better, like assisting with canceling unwanted or even forgotten about subscriptions. As a multi-billionaire thanks to YouTube money, I'll sign up for subscription services willy-nilly that I'll eventually forget about. Rocket Money can identify that these charges are still reoccurring and can help me cancel them. They can also help you set budgets for yourself. Maybe renting out that baseball stadium for my birthday party perhaps is not the best use of my money. They can even help lower your bills, which sounds more fake than that email you might see saying you inherited $47 million from your long-lost uncle. But it's real. So if you want to start keeping better track of your finances, head on over to rocketmoney.com/Datto to get started for free today. That's rocketmoney.com/Datto to get started for free today. Thank you very much to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video. I did some first impressions about a month ago on the first iteration, but now that we have the full experience, I wanted to give some more takes on the experience as a whole, as we have 4 new bosses and the final difficulty now available, which was the main thing that I was really here for. Weeks 1 and 2 weren't really too difficult, but weeks 3 and 4 did step it up, although I do have some maybe light elitist takes on some of the bosses. Weeks 3 and 4 are not for the casual LFG raider, in my opinion, requiring not only the brain power for any sort of mechanics you might experience, but also the combat skills to deal with enemies that are actually somewhat threatening, in addition to health bars that mostly don't immediately plummet when faced with any sort of mid-tier weapon. Those who maybe don't have a ton of experience should either stick to the week 1 or 2 difficulties or just get some more practice in the actual raids themselves. You shouldn't be running the hardest difficulty for loot, in my opinion, but rather the prestige, or at the very bare bones level, just the love of the game. Even veteran players may struggle on the harder difficulties if going for platinum scores, so just be ready to actually try in a non-contest activity for the first time in a very long time. For anyone still looking for strategy, advice, in terms of damage strategies, my team mainly played around with whatever the surges were in a given week, leaning towards grenade launchers because they're really strong right now, some of the best options in the game, and because we're already very familiar with how rockets work. GLs like Cataphract from Trials, Edge Transit from Onslaught, rockets like Apex Predator from Last Wish, Cold Comfort from Ghost of the Deep, or even Crux Termination, which is a random world drop. These are all weapons that I would have on hand ready to go, along with some more encounter-specific weapons like Parasite for ATRAKS, Whisper of the Worm for Oryx or maybe other bosses, Sleeper Simulant for more mobile bosses like RHULK and NEZZY when it's Solar Surge, or maybe you want to try out Legend of Acreus for RHULK if you really want to try and play that way. Solid primary weapons and special weapons are also a must in addition to Tractor Cannon and or Divinity. Indebted Kindness, the rocket sidearm from Warlord's Ruin, continues to be a fantastic choice all around. The activity starts with Golgoroth from King's Fall, which is one of my favorite encounters of all time. A banger to start out with, and I think Bungie did a good job giving this fight a bit more juice. It's already a pretty mechanic-intense fight, so there isn't a ton of room to do much more without completely revamping the fight, which I don't think needed to happen. The people taunting have to deal with Minotaurs, as non-aggressive as they are, while people in the pit need to now deal with 2 unstable light debuffs instead of just 1. Going from -5 to -20 power in this fight was not that big of a deal, though, with the only thing that I noticed being that the darts that Golgoroth shoots at the taunters actually deal enough damage to scare me for the very first time during Pantheon, or even this boss fight in general. The next boss is Caretaker from Valve the Disciple, a solid choice with a few moving parts, although not a fight that I would consider world-class. Bungie added in some extra enemies to kill for people doing the taunting of Caretaker, and added in some more bees, for lack of a better term, in the room where the runners grab the symbols. They also made some slight adjustments to what kind of enemies spawned in, like ogres now spawning in, but those generally were not a big deal. Going from -5 to -20, the biggest annoyance were definitely the enemies spawning with the boss in later stages of the fight. You have to choose between dealing with them or dealing with the boss, and they actually kind of hurt now. So there's more risk of dying in general in the encounter. However, if you handled this encounter just fine in the first 3 weeks, I don't see it taking you much longer on week 4, with the biggest challenge still being get this fight done in 2 floors rather than 3, even though you still can get the platinum time in 3 floors if you just go fast enough. Again, not my favorite encounter of all time, but it is one that gets use of Bungie's "we don't want Well of Radiance to be that good" philosophy that has been showing over the past couple of years. Then we have Explicator from Root of Nightmares, probably the only encounter in base Root of Nightmares that actually challenged anyone and was actually interesting. So again, not a terrible choice. Fire tornadoes were added to the 4 platforms on the outskirts of the room to make standing on them actually kind of dangerous, which did end up being a much bigger problem than I thought they would be. The boss also shoots out more fire tornadoes during the damage phase, which will torch your team to death, and a Tormentor will spawn after indexing the planets. Tormentors have been a big part of the Pantheon experience, but fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, they are not boss level enemies and thus are susceptible to crowd control. So they don't often end up being a big deal unless you completely ignore them after breaking their weak points. Explicator also felt like mainly the same experience, going from -5 to -20 power. Some enemies are a bit more lethal, but it's kind of the same story. If you can handle it for the first 3 weeks, you can handle it on the final week. But it's tuned in a mostly fair way, save for some very unpredictable fire tornadoes on the outside plates. ATRAKS is a pretty unique encounter with a specific way of executing on it, which is why I think it made it into Pantheon. Is this a fight that I'm particularly in love with? No, I'm not. I would have swapped this for one of the 4 encounters I mentioned at the beginning of the video, but it is unique. Unfortunately, it's still tuned in a way that most teams are able to deal so much damage that they can ignore most of the other things going on. And if that weren't the case, I'd be willing to give it some higher praise, as most other fights here don't really have that same skip button. Bungie added in a tormentor on the bottom floor after you kill servitors, which is important for a platinum score if you're struggling for points. Some teams are going too fast that the platinum score bonus isn't enough to bring them over the threshold. Select enemies got a little bit of a health bump. That's nothing too unmanageable. The strategy here is tried and true, with entire teams equipping Parasite and a damage super to one-shot the boss or do as much damage as possible, with cleanup not being a big deal. It's worked this whole time. It works here now for the most part. Maybe some -20 runs needing a couple of people to take the elevator downstairs one time to finish the job. This is an encounter where I wish Bungie made people actually participate a bit more with the actual mechanics, because there's a lot going on, which makes for an entertaining encounter if done the way I imagine Bungie designed it to be done. Then we move into the second half with the new bosses, starting with Oryx, introduced in week 2. The strategy for Oryx has not changed week over week. New additions to Oryx include non-stop spawning Light Eater Knights, meaning you need to stay vigilant and make sure that they don't eat any of your bombs. The saddest Tormentor spawn I have ever seen, Knights on plates with solar shields and a little bit more health, and 2 shadow clones of Oryx in the Thunderdome instead of just 1. For me and my team, the Light Eater Knights weren't so much a threat as they were just something else to interact with instead of doing absolutely nothing like we normally do. But in a couple of other groups that I've been in, they have been much more of a pain point, which I guess is kind of the whole point. The Tormentor here is probably the saddest of the Tormentors added, because it spawns in while your team is completely immune to all damage during the damage phase, meaning you can just completely ignore it until you're done. The only snag here is if maybe you're too slow, instantly killing it after the damage phase is over, and then the bomb phase starts as opposed to the Thunderdome, and then everyone gets caught in a stack and you all get one shot or something like that. But much like many previous fights, there isn't a lot you can adjust here, as the fight's design is pretty set in stone. I do like this encounter more overall now that it's not as rigid as the D1 version, and now that the runners are random. And I do think its place is justified in Pantheon. I just wish I felt a little more threatened personally. It's still a pretty easy 2-phase with Whisper of the Worm, but I wouldn't want this encounter to be much longer than that anyway. In week 3, RHULK from Vow of the Disciple enters the fray, a fight that received a lot of praise for the boss damage portion of the encounter. In come the Tormentors after what feels like most symbol dunks, but they do actually pose somewhat of a threat, as if they go into the air for a dive attack, they can launch unsuspecting victims off of the platform where you're fighting. Nothing else changes in this phase though, and this is not a phase of a boss fight that I'm really that passionate about, although the ad clear is fun on higher difficulties thanks to tons and tons of grouped up enemies. What ended up really changing the game was the addition of a shadow clone of RHULK when you move to the next phase of the encounter, a clone that you cannot damage or really interact with. That being said, teams have figured out ways to control the shadow clone's aggro, which I think has taken some of the intensity out of the situation, not to mention a way to complete this encounter in an unintended way. Unfortunately, I don't really see Bungie going in to fix this when there are less than 2 weeks remaining until this activity disappears, so I understand. Still though, this added an extra layer of callouts to make and kept people on their toes even more when it came to dealing damage. I thought this was a really fun way to shake things up even more in what is already a damage phase that was shaken up from the norm, with Bungie trying to force people to move around during a damage phase for the first time in years. The biggest advice I can give about handling RHULK in this encounter is simply the golden rule of dealing damage. Dead DPS deals no DPS. You should prioritize staying alive at all costs over dealing damage. I know this sounds like very basic advice, but this is the most it has ever rung true in maybe the history of the game. Once my team had a clean run, no deaths, no rezzing, we easily two-phased this boss. Those not going for a platinum time can afford a death or two, but the more you prioritize staying alive, the better. Well of Radiance will not always save you in this situation, but it's helpful to be able to jump into one to quickly restore health and then keep moving. In week 4, we got the return of RIVEN and NEZZY, and we'll start with RIVEN. The big question for RIVEN's return was, are you gonna be able to cheese the encounter by stacking 6 players in the same room and just whacking away at her feet? And the answer, thankfully, is no. RIVEN now has extreme damage resistance during the first 2 floors, forcing people to actually do the entire fight. And thus, you would think, oh, problem solved, encounter is great now, right everybody? Hold the phone. The rest of the fight got barely any changes, save for a couple of extra Minotaurs in the first 2 floors and some extra enemies upstairs. Not only that, but the fight is easily done in one phase, especially thanks to the weak spots that you shoot on your way back down to the bottom floor. The platinum timer is tuned to be a 1 cycle of the encounter, and you can use grenade launchers to clear this pretty easily. Here's the thing. I'm glad that they fixed this issue that has plagued the encounter for over 5 years, as RIVEN is one of my top 3 favorite fights in the game. Its inclusion in Pantheon is completely justified. But you only get to experience this encounter on the hardest version, -20. My guess is that most people capable of getting this far on the hardest version are probably somewhat familiar with the encounter, and if they're not, the damage that they can output will trivialize the experience. The people who should be experiencing this encounter in its fixed form will potentially never see it, since they might not do the hardest version of Pantheon. And I do think that's kind of a shame. I also think it's a shame that the 1 cycle is so easy, as part of the experience way back when was having to do multiple cycles. A 1 phase was not always a guarantee. Beyond that, I was hoping for a little bit more to be done to the encounter, throw another wrench into the plan somewhere other than a couple of Minotaurs. For a lot of people, Bungie fixing the encounter to not be broken is going to result in an entirely new experience for people, and I'm happy for those people. But again, the people who will actually play this likely already know what's up, therefore making it not as novel of an experience as I think it could be. Finally, we have NEZZY, who ended up being a complete joke of an encounter upon first release, not even coming close to living up to the name of the final god of pain. So my skepticism going into this was pretty high, and I'm not gonna lie, Bungie kinda cooked here. First, you got a big boy Colossus in the middle of the room being disruptive, but still reasonably killed by 1 or 2 people. Next, you have 2 smaller Colossus on the sides of the room that can only be damaged by someone with the opposite flux buff. This is the buff that runners use to activate all the plates, meaning you need someone else to get buffed with the runners to kill these Colossus, adding in an extra layer of urgency. Then you have Tormentors spawning in on the sides of the room, which my team, pretty much ignored. Then a new mechanic where if you stand still for too long, NEZZY will call down beams of pervading darkness, which will just straight up nuke you. So no stacking up on that front plate for damage. There are constantly spawning enemies, which weren't too tough to take down, especially as a Strand Titan. A good Strand Titan ad clear player is going to do some real wonders here. But if you're not good at slaying out, you will run into trouble, for sure. Talk about a complete 180 for NEZZY, going from a dinky, boring fight over in a couple of minutes to a proper capstone for Root of Nightmares. This is what it should have been on day one. My team dealt damage in the middle of the arena with a couple of wells to help out, constant movement with NEZZY charging people often enough that you need to stay on your feet, but not so often that it feels like you can't do anything at all. You will get opportunities. It's a different experience to RHULK though, but similar in that staying alive is the best possible thing that you can do. This center positioning also helps block any Tormentors or Colossus that are still up on the sides of the arena, as you're not always going to be able to deal with them. In fact, that's one of my favorite things about the encounter. There are so many things to deal with that now it's almost impossible to deal with all of them at once. You are going to need to make some choices about what to prioritize in the middle of the encounter. It's like Bungie was playing a game of Civ 6 in the middle of the redesign and was like, what if we did this to a raid boss? And I think that's an idea that hasn't really been tapped into pretty much ever in the Destiny raiding game. Encounters are designed with the intent that you will be able to solve all of the problems all of the time. So to deviate from that, I thought brought an intensity that I haven't gotten to experience in quite a while. I didn't really talk about loot at all because it's something that didn't really impact me, as I was mainly just trying to get the full clear for the emblems. Normal raid loot is farmable. That's good. Adepts are not. A little bit of a letdown, but I'm personally not too torn up about it. The replayability factor after you get the final emblem is a bit low, but considering that this is only around for a very short time, I'm not really going to hold that against Bungie. The scoring system was a little ambiguous as well, with the difference between platinum score and platinum time not really being shown quite enough. I would like to see a little more clarity there in the future. If I were to rank all of the fights in terms of their revamps, not necessarily the fights themselves, but like a little bit, I would have to put NEZZY and RHULK towards the top. Even if I don't like part of RHULK, I still think the shock of a Shadow Clone is just too hard to ignore for the fun factor. NEZZY was also so bad at release that they could have done almost anything and it would have been better, but they did really a good job with this encounter. Next, I'm probably going GOLGOROTH and maybe Explicator with the Fire Tornadoes. These were both fights that had enough extra going on that I thought they got bolstered enough worthy of a revamp. Then I just think I'm putting the rest of them together, ATRAKS, Caretaker, Oryx, Riven. Although I think I was disappointed by Riven the most outside of fixing the cheese so that people actually need to do the encounter. For me, I'm putting it towards the bottom, but for others, I can see why something like Riven would go towards the top. The other encounters didn't get shifted enough to me to have a strong positive reaction, but I'm also not really feeling negative about them either. They're just kind of there. All in all, I think Bungie did mostly a good job in selecting which boss fights they chose for this activity, and did mostly what they could when it came to giving these a bit of extra juice. It's been a very long time since Bungie stopped revamping hard modes of raids with extra mechanics and features, and it's been very sorely missed. You need to build hard modes from the ground up when you build encounters. They're much tougher to put into an encounter after it's already built, and Bungie just did not want to do that anymore, which is kind of a shame. But I think Pantheon is a mostly good example of what can happen if Bungie chose to bring back hard mode raids with extra mechanics or designing encounters with these extra things in mind. I'm not expecting them to actually bring that philosophy back, especially considering the low population of players who engage with raiding, much less hard mode raiding. But I think Pantheon shows that they could if they wanted to. I also think it's a shame that something like this activity is going away in a very short amount of time, even though I know the goal was to only have it be around for a very short time. It's just one of the very few things in the game that has actually challenged the raiding scene in a long time. We have nothing that fully emulates the contest mode version of the raid at all, and this has been the closest thing to it. I realize that most people who complete a run of the hardest mode will likely never run it again, but I think having this super high-end goal for people to chase is nice for the game to have, even if they're only gonna do it once. So I hope Bungie sees how neat this activity was and can prepare something else for us in the future. Kind of feeling a light to decent 8 on this one. Transition. Have you given this activity a playthrough? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best. You're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe, and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Datto does Destiny. Bungie forever.